According to a recent study, a conflict over Taiwan would be absolutely devastating for the world. It would drop global GDP by a staggering $10 trillion, or 10% in one single year. And as you can see, a war over Taiwan would be much, much worse than even the COVID pandemic at its height. Losing access to Taiwan semiconductors alone would push the U.S. into a, quote, immediate Great Depression. People would die, and our economy would crash.
That committee will come to order. Good morning, and thank you all for being here today. And this hearing today is not just another discussion about long-term competition with China. This is about a very real, near-term threat and the narrowing window we have to prevent a catastrophic conflict in the Indo-Pacific. Sometimes this is referred to as the 2027 Davidson window, after former Indo-PACOM Commander Admiral Phil Davidson. But while Admiral Davidson did warn us about Xi Jinping's ambitions this decade, 2027 is not an American date, but a Chinese one. Xi has ordered the People's Liberation Army to be ready to take Taiwan by force by 2027. Xi's directive is backed by the largest military buildup since World War II on land, at sea, in the skies, in space, and across cyberspace. And that date, 2027, also marks the end of this Congress. That means that the 119th Congress may be the last full legislative session with a chance to alter Xi's calculus. We cannot delay. We must close critical gaps now. Weapon stockpiles, forward posture, contested logistics, cyber defenses, and Taiwan's readiness. Every decision we make on defense spending, arms deliveries, posture planning must be driven by that urgency, because deterrence delayed is deterrence denied. We have a great group today to deliver this critical message and discuss our plan and our path forward to deter the Chinese Communist Party's catastrophic ambitions.
The deep ties between Taiwan and the U.S. and the CCP's growing threat to Taiwan and, by extension, America and the world. 3 years ago, I had the privilege of visiting Taiwan for my first time with then-Speaker Pelosi. After the trip, this poll by Morning Consult was taken asking Americans if they could find Taiwan on a map. It turns out that only 34% of Americans can correctly identify Taiwan, which is that green dot on the map. A lot of people thought Taiwan was in other places, where these yellow dots indicate, even up in the Arctic Circle in Russia. This hearing is important for many reasons, not necessarily to teach geography, but as an opportunity to clearly explain to Americans why Taiwan is so important. A lot of Americans may not appreciate just how essential Taiwan is for our own prosperity in America. Taiwan is America's 7th largest trading partner, and it is a huge, huge market for U.S. exports. Taiwan is also a major investor. Since 2022, Taiwan's investment in America has skyrocketed, surging from $1 billion in 2022 to $14 billion just 2 years later in 2024. This brings me to my final point. Before Taiwan's election last year, the CCP said that the results would mean, quote, peace or war. I showed you how Taiwan celebrated its successful democratic election, but the PLA responded just a little differently, practicing a blockade and a missile attack on Taiwan. This is a clip courtesy of Chinese state television. A little ominous, if you ask me, but that's how they greeted the results of the election. We know that Xi Jinping has ordered the PLA to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027, and that clip gave you a visual of what a prelude to a possible invasion could look like. America, as the chairman mentioned before, America does not want a war over Taiwan. A CCP attack on Taiwan would be unacceptable for our prosperity, our security, and our values. Chairman Xi, know that America on a bipartisan basis stands for peace across the Taiwan Strait. However, we will not tolerate actions that put peace at risk.
The threat of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is no longer distant or theoretical. The urgency to restore credible deterrence in the Indo-Pacific has never been greater. Taiwan's security is not only about protecting a vibrant democracy, it is about preserving regional stability, defending U.S. interests, and maintaining the credibility of our alliance network from Japan to the Philippines, from Australia to India. It's about defending our homeland and gaining forward positional advantage. The PLA Army is the decisive force. We must stop pretending that this is just a naval or air power problem. If the PLA Army cannot land, cannot maneuver, cannot hold ground, and cannot subjugate the people of Taiwan, it cannot win. If we can prevent them from even attempting to cross, we deter the war altogether. For far too long, we've invested in exquisite systems to fight a sea and air campaign, but left ourselves exposed where it matters most, on land, where wars are won or lost. Land power, not in isolation, but as the backbone that enables the interdependencies of the joint force, is what enables deterrence. Our most capable partners in Asia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, India, and Indonesia, all field large and capable armies. If we integrate them, if we train and network them to operate with U.S. forces, we create an Indo-Pacific land power network that multiplies deterrence tenfold. The PLA does not fear our ships and aircraft. In fact, they expect them. It has built an A2AD arsenal to deny them. What it fears is a credible force that can counter its army on its flanks, in its interior, before it assembles and loads, and before it ever reaches Taiwan. That's what forward-positioned, allied land power brings to the table. Let me highlight three key Army capabilities that matter most in the Indo-Pacific. First, mobile ground-based strike systems like Typhoon and HIMARS can disrupt PLA planning and decision-making. We need more of these, longer ranges, reloadable, mobile, and fully networked into a joint fires web. Second, the Army's multi-domain task forces. They bring together long-range sensing, cyber, space, AI, electronic warfare, and fires into a seamless operational construct. These units provide targeting, deception, and control across all domains and must remain a top investment priority. Third, none of this works without sustainment. The Army leads in logistics, medical support, engineering, depot-level supply, maintenance, and inland transport. It's the backbone of the entire joint concept. Without Army sustainment, agile combat employment from the Air Force and expeditionary basing cannot function. We must push forward AI-enabled manufacturing, co-production, maintenance, and pre-positioned stocks now, not later. Army forces also build lasting regional partnerships that no other service can. These relationships secure terrain, both physical and human terrain, and they build the security architecture that binds the region together. That's real deterrence. So I'm going to urge this committee to consider a strategic realignment, expand joint campaigning with Army-led partners, invest in long-range precision fires, integrated air and missile defense, AI, EW, resilient networks and theater logistics, build and strengthen the land power coalition that already wants to work with us, and recognize the PLA Army as the decisive threat vector for Taiwan. You can't invade Taiwan unless you can generate an invasion force, and that is what we must prevent.
This hearing today, I think, is really well-timed. As we speak, America's ability to defeat a Chinese attack on Taiwan is eroding. Beijing's military readiness has benefited from a 30-year investment focused on advanced technologies that specifically target U.S. vulnerabilities. In the face of this threat, America's ability to deter China is withering, and thus the risk of a conflict is growing. One of the biggest challenges that the United States and Taiwan face is that we need to prepare for the most dangerous scenarios, the cross-strait invasions, the maritime blockades, but in addition, we have to prepare for the most likely scenario. That's a comprehensive cyber-enabled economic warfare campaign. Because a cross-strait invasion or blockade would cause the most destruction on Taiwan, I think Beijing will want to force Taiwan's capitulation through less drastic methods, like a comprehensive pressure campaign that targets the financial, the energy, and the telecommunication sectors. And I think this will be facilitated by malicious cyber activity and military feints that further stress Taiwan's societal resilience. My written testimony identified 20 recommendations across 2 broad lines of effort that Taiwan and America can take. That first line of effort is about siege-proofing Taiwan and enhancing its ability to defend itself. Deterrence will only work if Taiwan credibly prepares for both of these most dangerous scenarios. But organizing and equipping Taiwan's forces will also require the United States to be a better, more effective partner. The stories of egregious foreign military sales delays are not anecdotal. They're persistent. And alongside that foreign military sales, the U.S. should maximize its military assistance to Taiwan through FMF, Presidential Drawdown Authorities, and Congress's new Taiwan Security Cooperation Initiative. Taiwan is too small to handle the Chinese challenge alone. The second line of effort is about us, protecting America's ability to respond to and win a war in the Western Pacific. China is pre-positioning disruptive and destructive cyber capabilities in U.S. critical infrastructures. They're also developing cruise, ballistic, and hypersonic missiles that can impact the U.S. homeland. Beijing wants to disrupt America's ability to fight, and we must not let that happen. In the cyber realm, the United States needs to improve the security of our rail, aviation, and port sectors to ensure that we can reliably move forces from forts to ports. Congress should investigate using the National Guard to conduct some of this defense of America's critical assets. Similarly, we need to build our societal resilience against Chinese malign influence. Last year, Congress wisely took a critical step by requiring the sale of TikTok. Any White House effort to save TikTok must ensure ByteDance is divested of its control over the TikTok algorithm. In missile defense, the Golden Dome effort could be a great first step if it focuses on a long-term, space-based approach to defending the homeland. And we need to double down on America's investments in hypersonic defense. At this moment, we have no answer to Chinese maneuvering hypersonic missiles. Finally, we need to create an independent cyber service in order to maximize cyber force generation and allow U.S. Cyber Command to compete with China's exploding cyber capabilities.
I'm grateful to be joined with such wonderful patriots who've devoted so much of their careers not only to the maintenance of peace and stability in the Western Pacific, but also to American power in the Indo-Pacific. I will say that this peace and stability which we enjoy across the Taiwan Strait is largely a result of legislative action. This is the example of legislative leadership, beginning with the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. For decades, it was only the United States that was recognizing and supporting Taiwan's importance. But over the course of the last several years, something remarkable has happened. Many of our allies and partners are joining with us in engaging Taiwan, and they are speaking out publicly that they too have an interest in the maintenance and peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. Now, the gentleman sitting next to me can tell you all the important elements of deterrence on the military side, but I will also tell you Beijing takes notice in how other countries respond. And the fact that we've gone from 1 or 2 countries talking about the importance to Taiwan to absolutely dozens now is an enormous achievement, not only of this body, but the United States, and that should continue. And I do fundamentally agree with my colleagues that we need to do more about our own capabilities. And I'll just, from my own experience over the past 30 years working on these issues, I'll just tell you where I think the big issues are focused. First of all, I do not believe we can take this challenge on by ourselves. We need much deeper engagement with our allies and partners, and that means Japan, that means South Korea, that means Australia, that also means increasingly countries like India and Vietnam, and I will also tell you countries in Europe who also believe that the maintenance of peace and stability is in our interests. We need much greater integration militarily and strategically. We need to embrace these partnerships. I agree that we are facing enormous challenges from Beijing, But we must be honest that some of the biggest challenges that we're facing are debates here in the United States. We occasionally hear discussion about spheres of interests and influence, and maybe this is too far for us and it's in another major authoritarian country's neighborhood and we should look at this differently. Those concepts are contrary to our strategic interests. They are un-American, and they do not align with our historic responsibilities, our commitments, and what we all believe.
In your testimony, you mentioned that America's window for strategic decision-making is closing, and that we must accelerate our own preparations. Can you help us better understand the stakes in the starkest terms possible, given your decades of service, and are we currently moving with enough urgency?
Chairman, no, we're not. I guess I'll just describe, from 2014 to 2024, when I left command, what the Chinese military were doing 10 years ago compared to what they're doing today is dramatically different. And that trajectory that they're on is what we actually have to slow down. The problem is that our organic industrial base, and so I just think the window, Chairman, is narrowing, but it's also narrowing for China as well. So it's not all bad news. President Xi is 71. He'll be 81 in 10 years. And I know that this window of 27 is still, sort of on the table. Are they rehearsing? Are they preparing? Absolutely. But I also think that we're in a very good position to be able to counter them because we have this advantage, and that advantage is the partnerships of the allies and partners in the region. So when we can bring them together as a counterweight to the thing that they try to fragment and fracture every day is our network of allies and partners.
You talked a little bit about cyber and resilience for our cybersecurity. What 2 or 3 things could we be doing to help with that?
So the most important thing for us is to get our rail, aviation, and port systems secure. And the way we do that is through legislation. And that legislation will need to address, and appropriations, it'll need to address the sector-risk management agencies.
This is a sound of an air raid siren. It goes off 3 times a day in Taiwan when Chinese warplanes fly dangerously close to the island. Imagine Russian planes approaching American airspace. Last year, Russia flew warplanes into Alaska's air defense zone 36 times. In contrast, last year, Chinese warplanes flew into Taiwan's air defense zone more than 3,000 times. This is what it looks like. These red lines around the island are basically the path of Chinese warplanes as they traversed the air defense zone surrounding Taiwan. Admiral Montgomery, by doing this, the CCP is trying to wear down Taiwan's defenders and probe Taiwan for weaknesses, right?
Exactly. This is what we would call a maximum pressure campaign. They use these military tools, cyber tools, and other financial and energy tools to put a constant pressure on Taiwan's societal resilience. And then at some later date, they can just dial that up when they see that there's no Western response.
Let me turn to my last topic. While these air crossings happen almost daily, making invasion seem possible, a more likely scenario is a CCP-led blockade of the island. And here's how it could unfold. Step 1, the PLA calls snap exercises like those after Speaker Pelosi's 2022 visit. You see all these ships surrounding the island. Step 2, instead of leaving, PLA warships stay in place, and then Chinese Coast Guard and militia vessels fill the gaps, creating a de facto blockade, which of course is an act of war. Step 3, the real test comes when imports like corn and soy from Illinois, Michigan, and of course South Dakota try to reach Taiwan, as you see here, but they are stopped by the CCP. In that moment, we are on the brink of war. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were famously, quote unquote, eyeball to eyeball with the Soviets, and the Soviets blinked first. But we don't want to get to that point where we need to be eyeball to eyeball with the CCP.
They use these military tools, cyber tools, and other financial and energy tools to put a constant pressure on Taiwan's societal resilience. And then at some later date, they can just dial that up when they see that there's no Western response.
That one way Taiwan can deter a blockade is by stockpiling, for instance, corn, soy, natural gas, and so forth, right?
Yes, Ranking Member, absolutely.
What more, Secretary Campbell, do we need to do to show Xi Jinping that he should never think about trying to blockade Taiwan because it would fail?
I will say that deterrence comes with a recognition that if such steps were taken, that China would face the most brutal financial steps taken against it, not just by the United States, but by other countries as well. We also need more stepped-up military capabilities. I believe if the United States, Australia, and Great Britain can step up our joint capabilities, that is a major deterrent. We need to keep that area of advantage where we are still 10, 15, 20 years ahead of Beijing and in operating in the undersea domain.
We need to begin practicing escorts and reflaggings with Taiwan. The other, you didn't mention it, but LNG, liquid natural gas, is the real, I think that's the first thing that's going to tighten them up during this. And we need to, ahead of the event, do reflagging and convoy escorts with the Taiwan Navy, practicing with LNGs, and even try to pull the Japanese into that as well, who are equally vulnerable to this.
This is not just a U.S. problem. This has to be a Taiwan problem, a Japanese problem, a Philippine problem. It's got to be the entire first island chain to include South Korea. And there are angles and things that we can do from areas to counter what you were just outlining there, the 9 EDCA sites in the Philippines. So you can see how valuable that port, and it's a deep water port, and the warehouses are, Hiroshima area. There's 2 Army ports down there and 5 different small installations that were built by the Japanese after the Second World War under the U.S. Leadership. We're only using about 40% of the storage on the ground in those facilities. Never mind Sagami Depot outside of Tokyo. Never mind the stores that we have in Kadena and Okinawa. And of course, the preposition equipment that we have in Korea. I guess the point I'm making is that we have physical access right now.
Should we abandon strategic ambiguity? Would deterrence be served by shifting to clarity as a policy of deterrence?
Congressman, my own view would be that the policy that we've adopted over the last 40 years, which I believe has substantial elements of clarity within it, but our declaratory position that you described, I believe, has served our strategic interests. And I believe there's still elements of that that can and should be sustained going forward. So I'm more focused on the steps that we're talking about here in terms of preparation. But I also believe we've been unmistakable strategically in our public declarations about what we stand for and what we're...
Let me drill down on a detail of that. As you know, the PRC uses UN General Assembly Resolution 2758 to isolate Taiwan by misinterpreting the resolution to justify its fraudulent one China principle. Although the resolution makes no mention of Taiwan, does not authorize the PRC to represent Taiwan in the UN system, and certainly does not state that Taiwan is part of the PRC. What should be the U.S. position on China using 2758 to claim that Taiwan is part of China?
We should resist that at every possible effort, both in New York, in Geneva, and all the other UN activities that we're undertaking. Look, the truth is that the UN is a pretty important battleground for hearts and minds in the global South. We're frankly hurting our ability to operate in many of those capacities. I think one of the reasons to engage here is that it is essential that we get all these other countries in Latin America, Africa, and elsewhere that are buying into this approach to understand that it's contrary to their interests as well.
Now, sitting on the Armed Services Committee and the China Committee, I can tell you I am confident that if Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party do what they have promised to do and try to take over this island, try to start this war, we will win it. We will defeat them. But hundreds of thousands will die. We could lose the satellites that enable GPS, so no more Google Maps to get home. And it would be a horrific worldwide economic calamity. So the point is that we have to succeed at deterrence. Now, General Flynn, you said that deterrence is the sum of posture, capability, messaging, and will. I would posit that you can win without posture. Armies have won throughout history without the best capability, and we don't often have the right messaging. But my concern is will. I don't think it's helpful to have a president equivocate on whether we would defend Taiwan as President Trump has. Given where we are today, how do we ensure that Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party understand America and Taiwan's will to fight?
Sir, I think this is why we have to have positional advantage forward. There's no substitute for hard power being forward.
What I would say is that I do think that the real deterrence is us and Taiwan becoming more integrated. I don't share General Flynn's optimism about Japan, Philippines, Australia actually contributing. They may give us access during combat. I'm not sure they can contribute. The one country I know will contribute to the defense of Taiwan is Taiwan. And currently, our military coordination our military interoperability is down at the deconflicted level, the lowest level. We have to raise it to coordinated, integrated, and eventually unified. And this normally takes 10 to 15 years.
How long will it take us to design, build, and deploy this capability?
Look, if we do it right, we're going for the long term. The worst thing we can do right now is go by.
It's been estimated 15 years. How long do you think it will take our adversaries to
So I think
to get around?
a space-based system is now 5 to 8 years away, and they would be both search and tracking.
If one of our adversaries is willing to launch a massive attack against us, which this system is designed to stop, thousands of intercontinental ballistic missiles, don't you think they'd be willing to detonate just a single missile to take out every LEO satellite, to take out that defense system?
So this is not about stopping a nuclear exchange. What will stop a nuclear exchange is mutual assured destruction. What we need Golden Dome for is the hypersonic missiles, cruise missiles, and conventionally armed ballistic missiles that China and Russia are now building.
What you just said, I think, is incredibly important, and it's lost on a lot of people in understanding Golden Dome. So thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I yield back.
Could you speak about how investing in our allies, partners, and particularly through infrastructure projects impacts America's competition with China, specifically in Indo-Pacific?
Great, thank you, and I very much appreciate the comments that you've made, Congressman. I do want to just underscore one other point that was just made about investment into the United States. If you look over the last 5 years, the countries, by and large, that have dramatically increased their investment in our infrastructure in the United States, enhanced battery projects, semiconductors, just down the list. It's Taiwan, South Korea, largest investor of any country in the world in the United States, Japan, and Australia. So those trends are very positive. That work is well underway. I do want to just point out something. If you ask me, what is the most formidable partnership, militarily, strategically, on the planet today? It's not the United States with any of our allies. It is Russia with China. And the fact is, what China is doing to help Russia on the battlefield in Ukraine is truly concerning. But remember, it's the reverse that's going to affect us as well. Russia has capabilities, hypersonic capabilities, silencing of their submarines, things that they're going to provide to China that are going to provide a real threat to us. And so understanding that this relationship is affecting not only peace and stability in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific as well.
So I sit on the Armed Services Committee, so I understand the need to be hawkish in this particular environment, but I have a basic question for the panel. Does China even need to invade Taiwan to achieve its reunification goals? I mean, could they just economically isolate Taiwan as the U.S. imposes and threatens it with 32% tariffs? Could they undermine Taiwan's democracy through intensive disinformation campaigns? We know that China is using generative AI to ramp up their disinformation campaign and conduct what is ultimately, I think, is, you said, General Flynn, psychological warfare that divides Taiwan's people. We also recently shut down the State Department's Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference Hub, which was key for us to coordinate with allies and expose disinformation. We've also eliminated the U.S. Agency for Global Media that was our counter-messaging arm to get at this disinformation. Could they literally force Taiwan into submission by causing Taiwan to question its, the U.S.'s commitment to its defense as a result of our actions and words in the region and in places like Ukraine? Simply without even firing a bullet, as a result of our action and inaction in this particular case, could China achieve its goal?
In my mind, the most likely scenario is they're going to try this cyber-enabled economic warfare campaign, abetted and facilitated with cyber malicious activity and with military feints. And what they do is just drive the pressure up on Taiwan and try to break their societal resilience. Taiwan, the President Lai and his team feel this is the most likely scenario as well, and they have set up a task force on societal resilience to deal with it. It includes information operations, cyber, financial, communications, and energy. We've run tabletop exercises in Taiwan and with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee looking at exactly this issue. We're happy to run them with you to show you exactly what will happen in an energy-driven, cyber-enabled.
We have to take the actual military instrument that they have built and what they do with it, and we have to counter that. So the ultimate, the goal would be to subjugate Taiwan without invading. However, we cannot discount the threat that they pose by what they do with their air, maritime, and ground forces, or cyber, space, et cetera. So that has to be countered in a very real way, and that's my position is forward positional advantage gives us hard power forward to deter that.
You mentioned the China-Russia relationship. In this area in particular, are we underestimating that particular bond and their ability to use their joint assets to really come at Taiwan and create this divide?
Yeah, at the same time that Russia is deeply and actively engaged in this brutal, illegitimate campaign in Ukraine, they're also increasing their operational dynamics with China in the Western Pacific, operating around Japan, in the Taiwan Strait. You've seen statements from Russia indicating that they would be prepared to potentially participate with China in actions there. If we have a faltering of our will, if we have statements that somehow, gee, we're not as interested in this, or gee, let's figure out how to get along with Xi Jinping. Ultimately, what that will lead to are questions in Taiwan about the United States, about our role and our commitment. And that's what China wants. That's what China wants, is not to cut a deal with us, but to have us signal somehow that we're waning in our commitment, and they will then use that to go to Taiwan and say, see, your backer has lost its will. That is why the work of this committee is so important.
I mean, clearly we know this. The CCP is the single greatest threat to global peace and security. We all agree on that. But across the world, we also know right now our allies and our partners are increasingly worried about us. A poll this spring in Japan showed that 48% of Japanese respondents believe that the international community cannot rely on the U.S. A shocking 77% doubted that they would come to Japan's defense in an emergency. In Taiwan, a poll showed similar trends. Over 57% of Taiwanese respondents felt that the U.S. was no longer dependable, and a Brookings poll showed similar declines in perception and trustworthiness, dependability, and favorability in South Korea towards the United States just in the last few months. Given this lack of trust, given the talk we had about the willingness to fight that Representative Moulton talked about in our allies and partners and in Taiwan, does this concern you that these perceptions are there in the first, second, and third island chain?
I've seen nothing but strengthening in our partnerships. The fact that we are actually there and that confidence that's gained by us being in those locations, I've seen nothing but a tightening of that at least the military-to-military partnerships.
But I will just say, again, this is public perception, not the military action. It's what I'm getting at. The war will be fought on multiple fronts. We are secure in the defense side, we know that, but it's the war of the mind, and it's the war of the people and their will.
I would just say right now, I think the biggest challenge we face in terms of maintaining peace and stability is if our allies and partners lose confidence that we are the America with all of our warts and flaws that they've known for the last 40 or 50 years, and that we're backing away from our commitments to the maintenance of peace and stability. If we lose that edge, then I think the global circumstances will be very dangerous.
And in fact, last week when I was reading The Economist, there was an article that in essence said that. The quote that struck my eye was, if America weakens its commitment to defending Taiwan, then Taiwan may lose the resolve to resist. And if Taiwan is not prepared to defend itself, America will be less likely to come to its aid. So, General Flynn, I know you're not an expert on politics, but you talked about President Lai understanding the importance of mobile survivable systems. Of course, Taiwan's a split government. It's always a little harder to get things done in that environment. What is your assessment? I mean, is there broad consensus around that idea?
From the political side and the military side, in my view, that is moving in a very, very positive direction. We have momentum, and we can ill afford to lose the momentum.
The joint training team in Taiwan, so that they can do, that's a U.S. team there that's about 500 people now. It needs to be 1,000. If we're going to give them billions of dollars in assistance, sell them tens of billions of dollars worth of U.S. gear, it makes sense that we'd be over there training and working. Your Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act directed the department to do it. I would say gently they've been slow. So the answer to the question is we can drive their preparations. We can help their preparations, but it's going to take U.S. engagement and involvement in this to kind of get them to the point where they really have a true counterintervention force.
So, Admiral, you talked in your testimony about the importance of siege-proofing and how that's really tied to being properly resourced. You talked about 3%. Again, in divided government, it doesn't look like maybe everybody's on the same page there yet in Taiwan. Then you talked about stepping up to 5%. Did you choose that number because you think that's what's politically possible, or does that number actually get siege-proofing accomplished?
So it's based on three things. One, it does get siege-proofing accomplished. That kind of budget will do it. It'll buy them not just the systems they need, but readiness. They will get to 3% this year. They're going to spend several $billion on readiness. And the other thing about the 5% is, historically, looking at democracies, that's about where democracy can end up. The only one that's been above that is Israel. And in fact, it went below it before October 7th.
I mean, it is aggressive, though, right? I mean, the United States is there. Poland, I think, is now there. But is kind of anybody else at 5%?
We're not there. We're 3.4%.
Oh, yeah, right, sure.
So,
South Korea, in some respects.
South Korea is 3.5%. I keep hearing, like, people in the administration say 10%. 10% would mean they would have to buy $40 billion worth of FMF from us every year. I think you all are well aware we can't crap out $3.5 billion worth of FMF a year. So unless our FMS, unless our foreign military sales program gets absolutely revitalized and improves 1,000%, they're not going to be buying, they're not going to be at 10% of GDP.
We've seen what the CCP is capable of in cyberspace. The FBI recently disrupted Chinese state-sponsored malware planted inside American routers and infrastructure. The malware is pre-positioned to disrupt U.S. logistics and communications in a crisis. We cannot afford to ignore that. Given growing cyber threats to our logistics and communication systems, how should Congress support efforts to harden military infrastructure and ensure our forces and our allies can operate even under cyber duress?
Each one of these countries also, including Taiwan, they're looking for how to organize their forces to do that, and then also how to, improve their tactics and techniques on how to operate in the cyber domain. Just the simple act of being able to perform forward to be able to do that is incredibly important. And then, of course, being able to share information, intelligence, and some of the nefarious activities that are going on their networks with these countries is incredibly important.
And you're absolutely correct. We can take all of the steps that we're discussing here, but a few flips of a few switches in a couple of places in Beijing can basically disable some of the things, the critical infrastructure in the United States, which is frankly essential to our ability to respond.
I don't really care to fight China's war or fight them in their own neighborhood. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but would you say that China's weaknesses are food, energy, and exports? Somebody want to debate that?
I would.
Okay. You think they are capable of producing all the food they need?
No, they're not.
Are they capable of producing all the energy that they need?
No.
And the export, they have a totally dependent economy based on exports because their capacity to produce far exceeds their capacity to consume. Is that correct?
I would agree.
So would it behoove us to take the fight further out? In other words, if they want, you talk about blockading Taiwan, what do we blockade them? But not right next to them, but blockade them way out. All right, so you can't get their food supply, they can't get their energy supply. And what if we develop partnerships, mainly with Europe, and say, if you indeed attack Taiwan, then we'll put an embargo on your exports and wreck their economy. Would that be a deterrent?
Yeah, I think it would be. I think we've been looking at
The work we're doing with India, Thailand, Vietnam, the work that we're doing with ASEAN countries, the work that we're doing out in Oceania, the work that we're doing in Northeast Asia, all of these areas are having massive pressure put on them by China. And so our partnerships, and again, geography and partnerships matter, and that's why having those forces out there to stay engaged. Again, this is where the Department of Defense and the Department of State have to be hand in glove with these different areas, because we can put pressure on China by that network of allies and partners, and then countering them in each one of these areas where they are absolutely putting their thumb on the scale, trying to disrupt and fragment and fracture our network of allies and partners that we enjoy.
If Xi Jinping wakes up one day and says, hey, the math doesn't work, even if I take over Taiwan, the impact on China as a whole is much greater than the gain that I get from China, then, maybe, it's not just about, treasure, blood, okay? It's about, and the number of men they're going to lose and the assets they're going to lose. It's about, hey, this is really going to hurt China. Right now, when just with the threat of high tariffs, orders ceased, and China was looking at full warehouses and then people getting out of work, all right? So the pain inside of China is going to be much worse. Hey, all right, I got Taiwan. What's the gain to that? Versus what's going to be the pain inside China if the world stands up and says, no, we won't tolerate that.
For 30 years since China's opening, the logic of global economics was a massive investment in China. And so as a result, until a couple of years ago, the greatest interdependence economically between any two nations is frankly probably between the United States and China. And if you ask what two countries are more interdependent but more uncomfortable with that interdependence, it's both the United States and China. And the only thing I would say, Congressman, we often discuss among ourselves, can you take this act and hurt them and put them under pressure? I have a different reading of what played out over the course of the last couple of days. I don't think it was just China that reevaluated. I think both countries blinked, because the truth is, if we take dramatic steps to distance ourselves economically, it will have consequences in both countries. The way I think we got to go about doing this, we need to invest more in capacities in the United States. We need to work more with allies and partners. We have to diversify these supply chains. But that is not an easy process, because we built up this interdependence for 30 years, and it will take more than just a couple of days to separate us. That is the direction that we're going, but it's going to be harder than we realize, Congress.
Now, Americans' over-reliance on Taiwanese chips has long been a bipartisan concern, one this Congress has sought to address, especially through our bipartisan Chips and Science Act, which encouraged chip makers like the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company to build more in the U.S., and now we call on the Senate to act immediately. Taiwan is the United States' largest partner without tax treaty. This limits TSMC suppliers' ability to easily invest in the United States, and with it, limiting the strength of the U.S. conductor ecosystem. Secretary Campbell, can you expand upon this a little bit? Why are economic ties between the U.S. and Taiwan so critical to curbing Chinese aggression?
Because we have every possible interest in increasing and deepening the economic integration between the United States and Taiwan. I think what we saw for years is Taiwan's primary engagement economically and commercially was with China. And those ties continue, but what we want to see is a diversification, not just with the United States, with other allies and partners, and that's taking place. If there is only one source of engagement economically and commercially, that creates the ability for another country to put a stranglehold on Taiwan. That's not in our strategic interests.
I believe that this administration's tariff policy has really hurt trust in the United States around the globe, sending unnecessary shocks through the markets, creating whiplash with each declaration, pause, and hike. And they stick a fork in the eye of our allies, the very allies we need to work with to compete against the Chinese Communist Party. That's not speculation. According to a recent poll in Morning Consult, tragically, China's global standing has surpassed that of the United States in 47 of the leading nations across the globe. As America retreats from our alliances, we leave open a void that CCP is all too happy to fill. Secretary Campbell, how does damage from the tariffs lower Taiwan's economic resilience to the PRC propaganda and economic coercion?
25 years ago, 20 years ago, Tibet was the big issue in China. Everybody talked about Tibet, human rights, sovereignty, the Dalai Lama. We don't talk about Tibet anymore. CCP has won in Tibet. They've suppressed all human rights. They've used forced labor and education camps. And so in many ways, they have won in Tibet. It's not even in our vernacular anymore that we talk about Tibet. Fast forward to Hong Kong and what's happened in Hong Kong. We all see it. We've all observed it. We talked about, a democratic movement in Hong Kong and it was going to be different. It's a surveillance state. And there's a reason why everybody has left, or lots of people have left Hong Kong to Singapore and other places because of what the Chinese have done in Hong Kong. But they've essentially won in Hong Kong in terms of what we were supposedly going to do or what our allies were going to do didn't work out. Now, in Xinjiang, little different story, but they're using the same tactics that they've used in Tibet and in Hong Kong. And as I think about Taiwan, they seem more emboldened than ever based on what they've been able to do through non-military efforts in Tibet, in Hong Kong, and in Xinjiang. And so there's that narrative there. And my question is, as we look at Taiwan, it doesn't seem like there's been any type of deterrence that worked in Tibet or Hong Kong or Xinjiang. I know Taiwan is a little bit different than those other two in many different aspects, but the narrative that I just laid out, talk to me about the Chinese thinking as it relates to what they've done there and what they're going to do in Taiwan.
So first, I do think it's a different scenario. It's a scenario where by the Taiwan Relations Act and by actions we've taken over the last 30 years, we are committed to ensuring that China does not impose a non-consensual solution on Taiwan. And we've made a lot of investments in that. So I do believe that there is an opportunity for deterrence here. But your implication's right. Deterrence is not just a capability or capacity to do something, but a belief that you're willing to do it. And then a credible belief that you're going to do it. It's been brought up here, our withdrawal from Afghanistan, our how we've supported Ukraine. Both those factors kind of make allies nervous about our commitment. They should make Taiwan nervous. So our job, Congress's job, is to be out there aggressively pushing legislation that makes the proper investments, both in weapon systems, munitions, but also diplomatically and economically, to signal to Taiwan that we're willing to fight and die with them. That's a tough signal, but it's one I believe in. I think it's one General Flynn believes in, and we spent our careers pushing.
Even though the Taiwan Relations Act, created that, but I'll just tell you from a military perspective, when I looked at and sized up their forces a couple of years ago, it was apparent to me that there was two-pronged problem. There was a part Taiwan problem, there was a part U.S. problem. But I do think, as I mentioned in my earlier testimony, that has changed. And I think that has changed dramatically because of the introduction of being able to train those forces. And so it gives them a degree of confidence that the United States is going to be there, and that the importance of them defending themselves and protecting their national sovereignty and their territorial integrity with their forces. And it is a whole of government effort on their part.
America, to me, is the greatest country on earth, and there's no challenge that American ingenuity cannot overcome. But when it comes to the strategic competition with China, America is in a far more fragile position than most Americans realize. And China is a far more formidable rival than most realize. And so there's a sense in which we've been lulled by our superpower status into a false sense of security. And I want to ask about a few areas, starting with critical minerals. Dr. Campbell, do you agree that critical minerals and rare earths are central to the defense and decarbonization of the United States?
Yes.
Which country controls almost all of the world's rare earth mining?
China, and as you understand, I know it's not just the...
Well, you're anticipating my next question. Sorry. Which country controls almost all of the critical mineral processing and refining?
China.
Yes. Do you think the United States is in a position to deter a foreign adversary who has a chokehold on the core components of our military defense?
Makes it that much more challenging at this moment.
Let's speak about the future of war. Do you agree that the future of warfare is autonomous?
I believe that will be an important element, yes.
Which country is leading when it comes to drones?
China is formidable. The United States also has capabilities as well.
But who can manufacture at scale?
China.
And scale matters in a war.
It does.
Which country is leading when it comes to robotics?
China, again, has formidable advantages here.
The U.S. has spent trillions of dollars on large legacy systems. Can you imagine a world where those large legacy systems are easily shot down by a swarm of autonomous systems?
Yes.
Okay, let's go to shipbuilding. During World War II, the United States emerged as the arsenal of democracy, building a total 270,000 vessels, including 2,700 Liberty ships in just 4 years. Which country is leading at the moment when it comes to shipbuilding?
China dwarfs us both in commercial and military shipbuilding.
And the former Secretary of the Navy would agree with you. He said that one Chinese shipyard has more capacity than all of our ships combined. China's shipbuilding capacity is over 23 million deadweight tons. The United States, less than 100,000 deadweight tons. The difference is a multiple of 230. Do you think the United States is in a position to deter a country that has 230 times more shipbuilding capacity than we do?
I think over the long term that becomes more challenging, yes.
Energy, the future of energy. Solar is emerging as the dominant driver of new energy generation. Who is the leader in solar?
China.
And China not only has an advantage in a single stage of production, it dominates the whole supply chain for solar energy. Is that correct?
That's correct. I'm not really sure what my role here is, just to say yes.
No.
Okay. All right. Yeah. But that's, I think the point that you're making.
Yeah. But I'm going to summarize, and then I'm going to ask each of you to.
All right.
So, but because I think it's important, the depth of America's vulnerability is poorly understood, even here in Congress, I feel. But China controls the critical minerals core to America's defense and decarbonization. It has 230 times more shipbuilding capacity than we do. It is so far dominating the autonomous future of warfare, and it is so far dominating the future of energy, you can give a much longer answer now. Is it fair to say, and I will ask this question of each of you, is it fair to say that we are catastrophically unprepared for a strategic competition with China?
So I think the point that you made in any comparison between the United States and China, China has substantial advantages in a number of areas. You didn't talk as much about technology, which I think is the key area that we have to worry about. You also touched a little bit on manufacturing.
We're slightly ahead in AI.
Well, I would just simply say, if you look at the critical technologies, AI, 5G, synthetic biology, and robotics, and look at where they came from 10 or 15 years ago and where we are today, I think even if we have a couple of months lead in a few areas, you got to be concerned. And so I think the general picture that you're painting is accurate. What we often hear right now are folks that point to a couple of weaknesses in China's overall approach: aging economy, indebtedness. The truth is China has substantial capacities that we're going to have to deal with, and ultimately they do have significant advantages in a number of areas that are going to be critical. So I'm completely aligned with you on
Although
that.
speaking of indebtedness, we, the United States, are presently spending more on debt service than we are on our national defense.
Yeah.